Hi, I am Alex Harris, and I am going to talk about winning debates with non-consequentialist arguments. I'm going to discuss the approach that I take. It might not be what other people take, and people might disagree with it. And it might not work for you. However, it has worked for me pretty well. So if this is something that you'd like to improve on, or it's just something you struggle with, etc., it would probably be useful to at least try out the things that I'm going to talk about. I understand that it's going to be possible to give comments. So if you comment as you like, then I'll get to answering any questions people might have, assuming they're relevant, at convenient points. What I am going to talk about here is a few things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what consequentialist and non-consequentialist arguments actually are, because I think that that's often the hurdle that people fall at, actually understanding what the argument they're trying to make is. After that, I'm going to talk about applying the way that they ought to work to a few different kinds of non-consequentialist arguments. The ones I've picked as probably the most common ones are complicity, duty, ownership, reciprocity, and I'm also going to talk about some democratic concerns, and that one's a bit more complicated. You might have noticed that a lot of those have overlap with one another, so I may say similar things, but I still think they're fairly distinct arguments. So first then, what non-consequentialist arguments actually are? And when I say this is the first hurdle that people often fall at, I mean, the issue is that the issue that I think a lot of people face is that they view non-consequentialist arguments as arguments that don't have impacts, and consequentialist arguments as ones that do value impact. Non-consequentialist are abstract ones. And to be absolutely clear, if you are trying to make an argument that dismisses all impacts, that's not a non-consequentialist argument. In fact, I would suggest that it is not an argument at all. Any argument needs to be made up of two components. That is, why what you are saying is true, and why what you are saying is important. And that second bit is what you are doing. So the second bit, rather, is the difference between a consequentialist and a non-consequentialist argument, that they think different things are important. And crucially, they think different impacts are important. So to be clear, consequentialism says that what matters is the overall final outcome, rather than how you get to that outcome, or how the impacts are shared across different groups. Non-consequentialism would argue that certain means don't justify other ends, even if the means are less, that you might care about some groups more than other groups, that you don't have the right to do things, you don't have the right to demand things of people, even if it might make the world a better place. Some examples of non-consequentialist arguments that I think are reasonably non-controversial, just to try and make them a bit less abstract than I think a lot of people consider them to be. It is a non-consequentialist argument to say that it would be wrong for the NHS to abduct healthy people and rip all of their organs out and donate each one to a different person. That's non-consequentialist because in consequential terms, you've saved, like, I don't know, 8 people's lives at the expense of 1. Consequentialism, at its most extreme, doesn't care if you've taken a life, because it's just 1 life. All it cares is the net number of lives that exist at the end of the exercise. I think when you consider that that is a non-consequential argument, the whole concept of them seems a lot less abstract than they could. Another is that parents have a particular duty to look after their own kids, rather than other people's kids, or whatever, that they should go out of their way to do things for their own children. That is perhaps something some people actually agree with, but I suspect that most people in the world do agree with it. But it's a non-consequentialist claim, because usually you might be able to do better things if you weren't doing your absolute best for your children, or potentially could. And one that is actually very common in debating nowadays. People like to talk about the priority of the state ought to be to the most vulnerable people, even if they are not the most numerate, or even if they are not the most necessarily have the biggest impact. There are perhaps consequentialist ways to make that claim, but I think fundamentally it's a non-consequentialist one. It is one that says that the state has a particular duty to people who need it more, either just out of necessity, because they've failed them, or what have you. But fundamentally, well, that argument at its best, at least, doesn't rely on consequentialism. It doesn't rely on it being the biggest impact to help the most vulnerable people necessarily. So that, I think, is the difference between consequentialism and non-consequentialism. I hope that's reasonably clear. So one thing as well that I think is another very common mistake that people make with non-consequentialist arguments is that they think the normal rules of debating don't apply. That is, I think the chief #1 ultimate rule of debating always ought to be comparative. Compare what you are saying to what the other side is saying. Compare even what you're saying to what your opening half is saying. Otherwise, the judges have no means by which to compare you to the other teams in the round, and then the easiest place to put you forth. It is particularly common, even among debaters who are quite good at being comparative, to be uncomparative when they try to make non-consequentialist claims. They try to make these claims absolutes, that it is never acceptable to, I don't know, take people's property away for whatever reason, that it is never acceptable to ask people to leave the country when they've lived there for X amount of time. The problem here, and the problem why I think a lot of people end up being frustrated, is if you don't weigh that absolutist claim against the claims that the other side are making, how can the judge possibly weigh them up? And even worse, people often respond to that feedback by claiming that the problem is that judges have a bias towards consequentialism, so dismissed their case unfairly. Perhaps in some cases judges do have some level of bias towards consequentialism, but I would suggest that most don't, and certainly less so than is frequently said. I think there are times when, if different principle frameworks, or a consequentialist one or a non-consequentialist one, are asserted, that the judge has to make a decision, one might be more intuitive than another. In the NHS example about stealing organs that I gave before, I suspect the non-consequentialist argument would be more intuitive and would win. In a lot of cases, the consequentialist one might be more intuitive, because it's just, how does the most good happen? So you need to explain why your prioritization of impact, and be clear, that is what it is. Prioritization of impact, which are most important, is more relevant than those of the team making consequentialist arguments. And one key step in doing this is point out that consequentialism is something which is saying we should prioritize issues in a certain way. Point out that that is the framework that the team is using, even if they have not said that they're using it. Say that that needs to be justified. Often explicitly making that challenge can be enough to highlight to judges that that calculation needs to be made, where otherwise they may have dismissed it. I also have a general rule for making arguments that you fear judges will dismiss unfairly, because of course it does happen, and that is point it out. Point out that this is something that is often dismissed. Point out, I know that this is something debaters like to laugh about. I know this is something that we frequently think doesn't matter in debates, but it does matter, and here's why it matters, and here's why it can't be ignored, and the other teams have to engage with it. That is a generic 2 sentences that I've said in countless debates, and it is really effective, because once you've said that, it is very difficult for judges to just outright ignore what it is that you're saying. Okay, that's the preamble over. Now I'm going to discuss how to apply the things that I've talked about in the preamble into certain kinds of non-consequentialist arguments, the most popular ones, I think, and what the best way to deal with other teams that might not adopt that framework in a round that we're in. One thing I'll say is that another very good way to lose when you're making a non-consequentialist argument is you make the non-consequentialist claim about what is important, whether that's like respecting ownership, whether that's reciprocity, and another team makes practical arguments. They explain, meet your principles better. You will, of course, lose. Saying that a certain non-consequential issue is what you ought to care about is, once again, just proving what is important in the debate, is not necessarily proving what happens. If you are in open government and you say that, you know, protecting ownership of culture is what is important in the debate, and closing opposition demonstrate that they do it better, you will of course lose to them. So non-consequentialist claims, again, I cannot emphasize enough, make the practical claims as well. They are, like any principal claim, they're supported by an explanation of what actually happens in the debate. That can't be ignored. First thing then, complicity. This is a non-consequentialist claim because it is about a bad thing happening or having happened, and the actor in the debate being some way responsible for causing or perpetuating that bad thing. And the non-consequentialist argument here would be, at its most extreme, that because of this complicity, the actor in the debate should change what they're doing or do a particular thing, even if it makes the situation consequentially worse, even if the outcomes are net worse. Some examples of where you might make such a non-consequentialist claim. A big one is in reparations. A common opposition argument in reparations being that, let's say we're talking about black people in the USA. A big opposition point could be that it increases racism against those same people, or that it in some way, you know, might be bad for them to have a sudden rush of money, that it might make people less likely to have good careers or something because they don't work straight away because they're happy with the money they have. Those are consequentialist claims, and I believe it is possible to win the debate on reparations while accepting those harms. Although I think you needn't, but I think you can. Similarly, a common motion is making development aid conditional on particular actions, often things like minimum levels of democracy. Obviously, that is a debate that you can win with consequentialist claims, talking about incentives, etc. But it's also a debate I think that the government can win with non-consequentialist claims, and complicity in that case is a big one. So that would be saying, even if it causes the country in question to backslide, you still shouldn't give them development aid because you will be complicit, and it's better for it to be worse without your input than it is for it to be what it is now with your input. One thing I'll say about both of those, and actually all non-consequentialist claims, they're usually stronger if they are alongside a consequentialist claim. So in both of those cases, that actually reparations to black people in the USA would be better for them, as well as them deserving it. And that we should take development aid away from democratic countries because it would be better for those countries and potentially other countries, as well as the issue of complicity. So, that said, if you do want to make consequentialist claims alongside non-consequentialist ones, I'll be very clear they are separate claims, because otherwise I think you find that judges often dismiss the non-consequentialist ones. So for example, we think you shouldn't fund these countries because you don't want to be complicit, and also it makes them better. I think it is easy for judges to say you think you're complicit because you're not making them better, therefore it's all part of the consequentialist claim, which is not. Right, so the impact in complicity arguments is whatever the bad thing happening is. So whatever the structural racism or historical slavery in the USA that is the reason why the government might consider paying reparations to black people, or in the case of development aid motion, the lack of democracy. And the severity of those impacts has to be explained. It has to be explained. Those are a serious thing that either affect or have affected people in a very negative way. And the key link between that impact and the claim you're making is that you must explain why that complicity exists. That is, what actions by the actor have resulted in this bad thing happening. Often these are intuitive. So in the case of reparations in the USA, I don't think it takes much to demonstrate that the US government is heavily complicit in the negative situation of black Americans. In the development aid motion, it was slightly more difficult. I think it is, it takes a few more links to explain why development aid facilitates authoritarianism, but I think it's very doable. I'm not going to go over that now. But again, that is a key link to link that impact, and that has to be done. That's something that's often not done when trying to make non-consequentialist claims. And the other key thing, of course, is being comparative, and this is probably the most important thing here. So the question you have to ask if you want to make this non-consequentialist claim is, why is washing your hands and getting rid of this complicity worth potentially worsening the situation? And this is where, in the two examples I've given, whether it's redress for past complicity or it is addressing present complicity, is slightly different, but the same basic principles apply. When we're talking about redressing past complicity, so in this case the reparations example, I would talk about the fact that the complicity of the United States government in worsening the situation of black Americans has had a material negative impact on their lives, that it has had a negative monetary impact on their lives, but not limited to monetary. That is tantamount to something having been taken from them, and the US government owes that back to them. Even if giving it back to them might potentially make things worse for them, that it is owed to them. It's their property, and it's theirs to do with what they want, and it's theirs regardless of what might happen around them. In the case of, and that's the concept of ownership, which I'm actually going to come back to later, so I will talk about this. In the case of the development aid example, and ongoing complicity is a little more difficult, I think, but very doable. That we think that the governments have a duty to not do active harm, that it would be helpful to talk about the particular urgency that your complicity causes, that there is an ongoing problem right now and you are causing it, so you need to do what you can to stop it. Again, similar to the last one, that we don't actually have a right to make calculations on behalf of these people. that opposition saying, but things might get worse, isn't good enough, because that is not for us to decide. I think what you might notice is that several of these claims rely on questioning the degree of impact in the consequentialist claim. So that last one in particular, about we don't have a right to make a calculation on their behalf, is contingent on it being uncertain whether or not they will slide into further into authoritarianism, brutal dictatorship, or what have you. And that's the nature of debating, that if you want to win with a non-consequentialist argument, you will have to engage with the consequentialist argument. If you want to win with any argument, you will have to engage with the positive arguments that other teams have made. So you will have to engage with their consequentialist arguments at their highest, potentially on their own terms, and then explain why your non-consequentialist argument is more relevant. At the end of the day, they're about assessing impacts. You are not going, or you're very unlikely to win in a debate, whether you're talking in non-consequential or consequential terms, talking only about your own material, failing to engage with any of the other teams, and failing to reduce the impact of anything they say. So that's an important thing to do as well. And another thought on the state should take action because of complicity is their citizens. Whatever a state does, they do on behalf of their citizens. Citizens might not want to be complicit. I was going to talk about democracy at the end, so I'll talk a little more about that then. And as a general rule, not just in terms of complicity, but in non-consequentialist arguments in general, at some point, any argument where you talk about what's important and what's not important is going to come down to an assertion. Hopefully it comes down to a fairly intuitive assertion that's been clearly linked to your main claim. It will eventually come down to an assertion. I think this is more important. In the same way that if you were using practical arguments to win a debate about what happens rather than what's important, you would, I think, or you would be well advised to use examples to illustrate your point so that the judge can more clearly see how your argument works, how you think that the steps go. In the same way as that, if you're making a non-consequential claim, if you're making a claim about what is important, what ought to be valued in a debate, examples are useful. You can't really use examples in the same way because it's not about, look, when you do this, this happens. It's about, when this happens, this is what we ought to value. And that is why thought experiments are something that can be very useful in a debate. So to take one of the examples I was talking about earlier, that money is owed to Black Americans in the form of reparations. We can't just decide that it would be bad to give it to them. If you've demonstrated that that money is owed to them, it would be quite useful, I think, in a debate to use an analogy to like owing someone money and saying, you don't have a right to say, oh, you know, giving them that money now will be bad for them because they're just going to misspend it, whatever. Because it's their money, you owe it to them. And they've asked for it, let's say. It doesn't logically prove anything that you haven't already proven, but in the same way as using an example, it illustrates the point, and that is very useful. And that can often be the thing that clinches it for you above another team. The next thing I was going to talk about was duties. And this is one of the core things that you will need to talk about when you're trying to make non-consequentialist arguments. The reason a duty argument is non-consequentialist is because the fundamental claim is that the actor in the debate should prioritize a particular stakeholder to whom they have a particular duty, or the highest duty, not necessarily the stakeholder who is most impacted by this action or lack of action. Whereas a consequentialist claim would say that whoever is most affected should be the priority. Wherever the biggest impacts are, should be the biggest priority. So examples of where you might use this. In a debate about whether parents who can afford to do so should choose to send their children to private schools. That there are obviously consequentialist arguments on both sides of that debate, but I think probably the biggest clash in that debate is, should you allow your children to benefit at the expense of other children? And one of the best ways to win that clash is to explain that you have a particular duty to your children for whatever reason, in a way that you don't to other people's children. And another example is trying to defend a state limiting public services to its own citizens. So a common debate that I've seen would be about restricting access to healthcare to citizens or like people with the right to live there, or what have you, at the very least, and not to just anyone. And one of the best ways to defend that is that you have a particular duty to your citizens as a state for various reasons. Again, like complicity arguments, I think it's much stronger if you make them alongside consequentialist arguments that say the stakeholders that you're prioritizing also happen to be the most affected. But again, if you do it alongside, it's worth saying, independently of them being most affected, you have the highest duty to them, and that alone is a reason to prioritize them. So the impacts that you'll want to discuss when you're making a claim about which stakeholder an act has a particular duty to is, well, firstly and obviously, whatever is happening to the group that you're talking about. So why it would be so much better for your kids to go to a private school than the alternative, why it makes a difference to limit services like healthcare to a smaller group. And you really do need to tease out what difference that makes. Why is it so much better to go to a private school? Because that's something that can obviously be challenged. Why does like open borders healthcare really affect other citizens, since they'll presumably also get healthcare? I'm not going to go into how I think you would justify those claims, but the main thing is that you do need to justify those. So you do need to make the practical links as to what happens if you're going to make this claim. And the key link between that impact and this claim of duty then is, why is there a particular duty to this group? Why do parents have a particular duty to their children? Why does the state have a particular duty to its own citizens? I think there are a few ways of justifying that a particular duty exists. So I'm just going to go through the most common. The first is that the actor in the debate has some sort of causal responsibility for making the stakeholder in question dependent on them. So the obvious example of this, what I've already talked about, is children. You've brought your children into this world with, at least some minimum level of autonomy, and you've done that in the knowledge that if children are brought into this world, that they are dependent on their parents. So you have a particular duty to make things good for your children. And a good way of making a duty argument stronger in this case would be, you firstly have a particular argument to make things as good as possible with the stakeholder in question. You also have a particular duty to ensure that they are held above a minimum standard. Obviously, it is likely to be challenged that children who don't go to private school are beneath the minimum standard, but there are various ways you can make that claim, that that you ought to hold them above the standard that they could potentially get if they don't go to private school. You should do your best to. Another way in which duties are often inferred is if the actor in the debate has a stated purpose. If that stated purpose allows them to exist, for example, gets them funding or just general popular support or something like that. So that's something that can be applied to the state quite well. The stated purpose of the state is to look after its citizens, resolve collective action problems, that manner of thing, hold citizens above a minimum standard once again. It's also quite useful when you talk about organizations. So, for example, a sporting organization might have particular duties to its fans, might have particular duties to its athletes. Companies would certainly have particular duties towards their employees. And on the flip side of that, they might have particular duties on behalf of. So, you might want to make an argument that a company is responsible for the actions of their employees in particular scenarios. So again, that relies on just explaining that they do benefit by having a stated purpose, because that's why they get funding, even if not from the group who you're saying they ought to prioritize, and therefore they have to live up to that value. Another way in which you might have a particular duty to someone is if you have coercive power over that group, which is similar to if they have a particular dependence on you, but it's a little different to what I was talking about with regards to children, because you have not necessarily created that dependence, but the fact that you have that control and power over them might be reason enough to give you responsibility towards them. So that, and also potentially the causal relationship of that dependency that I was talking about earlier, something that could be applied to the state having a particular duty to the most vulnerable. But I think all three of those together would be useful for demonstrating that, if that were to be challenged. That the state may have had a part in making them the most vulnerable, that the state exists to protect the most vulnerable, that that it exists to keep people above a minimum standard, which it often fails to do, and that the state has some coercive power over them as well, a particularly strong one, let's say. And the final one, which I'm also going to talk about separately, would be reciprocity, that you might have a duty to someone simply because they've done something for you. That would be a stronger argument if you've asked them to do that thing. So, for example, if we're talking about the state prioritizing elderly people for healthcare, for example, in the UK, there's been a big issue about asking older people to pay for their own healthcare if they're above a certain wealth. And one of the big objections to that is that that would be an unfair thing to do, because those people paid taxes all their lives, have been forced to do so, and have done so on the understanding that their healthcare will be paid for in their old age, their care costs. But that's a non-consequentialist claim. And it links back to having a duty to those people. But that reciprocity element can also be if someone has just chosen to do something for you and you felt benefit. One of those could be talking about the state owing a particular something to immigrants within its country. So, let's say a country has accepted a certain level of immigrants and that country has benefited as a consequence of doing so. You could make an argument that you therefore owe something back to them, and therefore you should give them some level of minimum treatment because they've done something for you. Even if it wasn't necessarily something you asked for, it was something that you benefited from and were happy to benefit from when it was good for you. In terms of making duty claims comparative, I would actually suggest that if you are able to prove that the actor in a debate has the highest level of duty to your stakeholder and other teams to other stakeholders, that is probably sufficient comparative already. Or it should be. But as always, I think when you are being comparative, you need to be explicit about how. you need to state that we think we've demonstrated that the state has the highest duty in this case to the elderly, and that it should be an absolute priority. That is a fundamental thing we have to do. And if other arguments have not yet been made, say, and if teams want to make pragmatic or consequentialist claims about how we could better benefit other groups if we don't do this, they need to disprove that our primary duty is towards these elderly people, or they won't get anywhere. And making that explicit statement about what the other side needs to prove can make a big difference in that argument being accepted for being at the level that it really is. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is ownership. This is a non-consequentialist claim because the claim boils down to that the actor in the debate should recognize the claim to something of the rightful owner, even where recognizing that claim might not lead to the best consequential outcome. Reparations is also an example of this. As I said before, perhaps something is owed to a particular group and needs to be paid back. But also property rights. Property rights are, I mean, there are consequentialist ways to suggest that property rights should exist, but there are many ways, and I've seen several motions that suggest that the state should take control of a certain piece of property for whatever reason. For example, to rehome people who have been harmed by some sort of disaster, even though those properties are owned by the people. And there are consequentialist reasons not to do that, but there are also quite strong non-consequentialist reasons to that is someone's property. You simply don't have the right to demand it from them. But ownership can also be something that's a lot more abstract than property rights or owing money to someone. For example, I think cultural appropriation is an argument that is frequently best made in terms of ownership, that certain cultural acts are owned by certain groups and it would be wrong to take them from them, even if you think you can make the world better understand that culture that actually is theirs to share, not yours to take. Like all non-consequentialist arguments, I think this would be stronger with a consequential argument that makes things better as well. But again, just be clear, they're separate to each other. In terms of the impact of ownership arguments, this is one that can be a little abstract. But effectively what it boils down to is you need to demonstrate some appreciable meaning to the owner of having this property. So to go through these examples, in reparations, the opportunities, the economic opportunities, the way people might treat you are things that can improve your life and make a big difference in your life. And that's something that is currently being denied to them because they haven't had these reparations. Cultural appropriation, you would need to talk about the value of this culture to whatever group it is that you're talking about, and why it being misused or taken less seriously can be a real harm to those people, that it can be very upsetting, or it can negatively impact them in a variety of ways. And it can actually make the culture worse in some way. And in terms of, if you're going to defend property rights, you need to explain why owning property is important, why, what it is that is important and makes a difference to someone if they didn't have that property as compared to if they did. And I would suggest an additional impact in ownership arguments is very useful, is usually that the people in question have gone through some sort of loss or opportunity cost in order to gain ownership of the thing in question. So if you're talking about property rights, the owners of that property have, generally speaking, gone through some sort of opportunity cost by buying it, by giving up other things for it. Even if they've inherited it, they could have sold it and gotten money for it. But they have gone through that opportunity cost and have denied themselves other things that they could have had instead of it. And I think that is something that is very important to spell out. Especially if you're up against a team that are trying to bulldoze it through consequentialist arguments that, yeah, but stock's better, so we don't care. The key link here is explaining why that ownership exists. And that opportunity cost that I talked about is a strong way of doing so, but there's more than that. So why that ownership exists and why it ought to be honoured by the actor in the debate. So I've already talked about it having been stolen and complicity in it, but that is a strong way to demonstrate this. I'm not going to go over that again. And I've gone through the opportunity cost of understanding. A third way of explaining why ownership is or ought to exist would be that the thing in question that ownership is being claimed of was created by or exists for the group in question. So it wouldn't exist without them, so they must own it. Culture being a key one here, but they are responsible for keeping that culture alive, for creating it in the first place. And also it may have been created to support their society, that it is important to them in that respect. And I think it is worth explicitly stating, whenever you've demonstrated that ownership exists, that failing to recognise that ownership is tantamount to theft, and that has to be justified on a principled level rather than just outcome based. And again, here is somewhere where a thought experiment can be useful. You can say to a team, look, you are stealing from these people and that has an impact on them. The fact that you make someone else's life better is not very useful to them. And a useful thought experiment to justify that could be, well, actually, the NHS example that I talked about at the beginning of stealing people's organs is an extreme one, but it does fit that same principled argument. But even something as simple as, do you think people ought to just have money randomly stolen from them in a street if it could be spent on something slightly more useful? And I think there will certainly be teams who say yes to that, but I think it's not very intuitive that you should say yes to that. And I think that is the point at which those same intuitions of judges that make people say judges have a bias towards consequentialist arguments would start to work in favour of non-consequentialists. I don't think it's very intuitive that we should just steal from people whenever money can be put to better use anywhere. And that's how we live into the comparative on this idea. That is, why should we care more about recognising this ownership than what could be gained by ignoring it? I think I've covered this fairly well, but just some things that are worth pointing out. That the owners of these things have no particular responsibility to help in whatever way they so choose. So they have no, if it's talking about people receiving reparations, they have no particular duty to use them in a good way or do anything good with them, or even care about wider repercussions. A culture that is having that is being appropriate has no particular duty to help other people understand it, that actually that's their choice to make. But even with things like rehousing people after disasters, that people who own the property that could be used don't have a particular duty to those who need to be rehoused. And I think a question that you're going to have to answer when you start going down this road is, which is a more primary right? The ownership of the people that you're trying to defend, or whatever is being provided at its expense? And again, you are probably going to have to mitigate what is being provided at its expense. If we're talking about rehousing people after a disaster, a potential response to saying, yeah, well, people own those houses, you can't just take them from them, is, okay, we recognize that the property rights are important, and we do value that, but we think a more primary right is having a shelter, being able to live somewhere. So we ought to prioritize that and temporarily suspend our absolute recognition of property rights. So you have to engage with the degree to which the right they are defending is provided. Property rights for people who need to be rehomed after disaster is a pretty hard sell if the alternative is those people being on the streets. It's not a very hard sell if the alternative is those people living elsewhere with all necessary facilities, even if it's not ideal. So that is something to bear in mind, that you will need to engage with the best version of the argument being made by the other side as well. You can't just make your non-consequentialist claim or your claim about ownership in a vacuum. So the next concept I want to talk about is reciprocity. This is kind of, and I've touched on this a couple of times already, because it's kind of a hybrid between duty and ownership. And the hardest non-consequentialist version of this claim is effectively, we should prioritize or take action for people to whom we owe a duty, or rather to people who've done something for us or will do something for us, even if it's not where we could have the biggest impact. So again, NHS care for the elderly is an example of this. Giving rights to immigrants, giving certain levels of services to immigrants is an example of this. So the impact that we'll be talking about in this debate would be what you could do for this person and what they have lost for you. So again, we come back to the opportunity cost idea that I spoke about earlier. And again, it is really important to really tease out what the difference between what you're doing for them and what you might not is. So if we're talking about social care for elderly people with a certain, who are reasonably wealthy, then the difference is effectively them having to pay for their own care and losing some money to do that. What they've lost for you is they've spent their entire lives paying taxes, they've spent their entire lives towards the cost of that care. The key link, though, is why their action that they've done in the past, or that they might do, means that you owe something to them or they ought to be your priority. I think one of the strongest ways of making that link is by explaining that they took whatever action they did on the understanding that you would repay them in this particular way. That would apply quite well to the claim that the NHS care for the elderly, or social care for the elderly, that they acted, paying taxes, etc., on the understanding that this would be paid back to them when they needed it, and that the state perpetuated that understanding. So you've made a commitment, and you need to keep to that commitment. And then that starts to fold into ownership. But it can also be a little more abstract than that. You might have a generic debt to someone, that the particular group has done something for you, and that this is the best way to repay them just because they particularly need something at this time. So again, that could be talking about immigrants, that it wasn't necessarily, you know, they have not necessarily come to the country on the understanding that X, Y, or Z will be provided for them, but they have helped, and therefore those things should be provided to them because they need them, or it could be really useful to them. Especially if you've relied on them by choice. If certain parts of national infrastructure are propped up by immigrants, let's say, and you've needed them and you've allowed and perpetuated the situation where you need them, then you might owe something in particular to them, even as a generic group, including the people within that group that don't fall into that category. And the comparative here is largely the same as ownership. That is, that the people to whom you have a reciprocal duty don't have the duty themselves to do anything for those who might be benefited by this policy, who might benefit from elderly people paying for their own care, etc. Last thing that I'm going to talk about in this session is just some general thoughts on democracy, which I think can be, like most things, justified on consequentialist terms, but some very non-consequentialist reasons for it as well. And I suppose democracy isn't really a concept in the same way as the other ones I've discussed, because it's more of a broad umbrella of several concepts, that accountability should exist, etc. But I suppose the biggest question when it comes to, in non-consequentialist terms, when it comes to democracy is, would it be good for a very effective government that wasn't accountable to the people to exist, even if it was not just the best one that could exist? And you will have some debates, particularly about the developing world, where you are asked to debate them. What I would suggest is a few ways to justify that are, first of all, that if a state, and it is going to be in terms of all the things I've already discussed, if a state is going to have coercive power over its citizens, then they ought to have some say over that. That a state will be acting in a way that we would not ever allow a non-state actor to act, imprisoning people, forcing people to pay money, and restricting what they can do otherwise. Therefore, it needs to have some sort of mandate. That is, it needs to have a majority okay from the people that those are acceptable things for it to do. And mandates are an important concept here, that if a party or a political leader or what have you has said that they will do a particular thing, they've been elected on that basis, that they ought to do it, regardless of if it's a good thing, or if you can prove that consequentially it would be negative for them to do it. They have said that's what they'll do, or they've given people the opportunity to choose, like a referendum, for example. That, well, if you talk about the EU referendum in the UK, many people might still think it is a bad idea, but I think it is a fairly intuitive claim to make, that even if you think it's a bad idea, or even if political leaders think it's a bad idea, they should still do it, because that is what was voted for, and that is what the government is required to do. I suppose mandate isn't quite the word you'd use there, but I think the same principle applies, that a government is bound to do what they say they will do, what they have allowed the people to vote on in the form of referendums, or what they have made their platform when they've been running for election, etc. That's pretty much everything I intended to cover in this session. I hope it has been helpful, and well, best of luck at the UDC and debating in general. Thanks very much.